Jag börjar med att dela min skärm direkt. Och ta den från början så. Och nu ska vi se. Så där var det. Då ser ni skärmen bara. Yes, and I'm going to talk in English. Hello, thank you for inviting me. My name is Flora Hajdu. I'm a researcher in the subject rural development at SLU, the Swedish Agricultural University. In rural development, we look at how people in various rural areas across the world live, how they make their livelihoods, what they feel are the most important issues from their own perspectives, how different policies, projects, and other things like pandemics or climate change affect their lives and livelihoods. Often we find that people and the environments they inhabit have been misunderstood by people and policies and by researchers. Instead of going to their localities and asking people themselves about their situations, many projects, policies, and research is based on large-scale aggregated data or various problematic assumptions about local realities that often turn out to be based on myths. So uncovering these myths are at the core of our subject. So today I'm going to talk about local social impacts of carbon forestry in low-income countries. What is then meant by carbon forestry? Well, you may have seen some of these claims. Here is Arvid Nordqvist saying that they offset your coffee, klimatkompenserar in Swedish. Here is Arla that says our milk has net zero emissions, netto noll klimatavtryck. And here we have Max who says our menu is climate positive, klimatpositiv. You may have seen that they also say that they are planting trees in Africa. So this is what is carbon forestry. In short, these companies emit carbon, but they claim that this is offset when trees they pay to plant elsewhere absorb carbon from the atmosphere. There are several different kinds of challenges to this claim. For example, an excellent talk by Alistair Skelton on the problems of this from a carbon cycle perspective, but I will talk about the rural development perspectives on this massively increased tree planting in low-income countries that is taking place. Now, tree planting has quickly become a huge global hype. Many of these projects are not necessarily offsetting and not certified. Tree planting is growing as a campaign in general. Even if there's potential in planting trees globally, the projects need to make sure that trees planted actually survive, that local people actually need them and can spare the space where they are planted, and that tree plantations do not harm local livelihoods or create local conflicts. This is difficult. The sheer size of these campaigns suggests to me that it's not possible to plant millions of trees in ecologically and socially sustainable ways. If we back up, this was a picture of a village in South Africa. If you look at this picture, do you think that this is a forest that's been cleared to make way for a village? Or is it a village built on natural grassland with forest in the wet river valleys? It's actually difficult to know how to interpret a landscape. And there are several pitfalls. Fairhead and Leach showed already in 1996 in their West African study area that policymakers and donors interpreted the savanna as degraded due to it having small pockets of trees. The local population was cast as those who had deforested the savanna landscape. But it turned out when they did satellite image analysis that the savanna in many places had been even less forested previously. People were in fact adding trees to their local environment. They traced the story of locally caused degradation to institutions that were getting money from donors when they were talking about the degraded savanna. So they wrote this book, Misreading the African Landscape, and they discuss how it is often said that areas are degraded without defining what it actually means to be degraded, and how a local people's overuse of resources tends to be seen as the cause for degradation, while large-scale commercial logging or agriculture is not blamed to the same extent. They call this the African Degradation Narrative. A narrative is a story that may or may not be true. That book was followed by a host of other studies on the degradation narrative in Africa, showing how we have repeatedly misread African landscapes as degraded, often without looking for further evidence. Misunderstanding about how savanna ecosystems function in combination with colonial ideas of Africans not having the knowledge to take care of their own environment led to these degradation narratives. One interesting example is this article where they describe how soil scientists were trying to determine if the soil in farmers' fields in West Africa was degraded. They decided to sample soils from farmers' fields and compare it with soil samples from sacred sites. They assumed that the sacred sites would have undisturbed soil, but they didn't bother to ask local people about these sites. They found that the sacred site had much more fertile soils than the farmers' fields, and they proceeded to conclude that farmers were degrading their soils. Later, it was shown that these sites were sacred because they were sites of old villages inhabited by humans who had made the soil super fertile through their gardening and waste production. So it was not a good baseline to compare their fields with these sites. Thus, I think this is interesting because it shows that seemingly a neutral study sampling of soil is not safe from being biased by degradation narratives. And since then, many studies have showed how misunderstandings, misconceptions, and prejudice about local people and their relationship to their environment often shape how different African environments are understood. Degradation narratives are today quite well-known concept within rural development and political ecology. Even in conservation projects, they have in the last decades increasingly started understanding that we need to conserve nature together with local people and not in conflict with them. However, fast forward some years and we are facing a new problem. We have ignored the climate crisis for a long time, and now we're desperate to find quick and easy solutions. Suddenly, we hear how people start talking about tree planting in Africa again. We hear that it's much more cost effective to plant trees in tropical areas, and we start hearing the familiar narrative that there is so much degradation in Africa that local farmers need education about how to manage their environment, how to manage their trees. In these discussions, we were surprised to find very little talk about this well-established problem of degradation narratives. We think this is because there are now new actors getting into the tree planting sphere. People who also have no previous knowledge about the many different problems that can arise if you try to make interventions in local areas. In this article we wrote, we go through some of the literature on degradation narratives and try to make the connection to carbon forestry. This is also what Leach and Skoons do in their 2015 book. But we decided we wanted to see one of these projects for ourselves to make sure what degradation narratives were not, that degradation narratives were not affecting these projects. So we selected a project in Uganda. In northern Uganda, a new healthy forest is emerging where previously there was only unused bushland. The forest binds carbon dioxide at the same time as it creates local employment and supports sustainable development. This text is from a brochure in Swedish, we translated it, from the Swedish Energy Agency. It describes an emission reduction project that Sweden as a country was buying credits from through the Energy Agency. I don't know what you see in front of yourself when you read healthy forest, but when we traveled to Uganda 2014 to see this for ourselves, we saw this plantation of pine and eucalyptus. This is Kachung plantation that is 3,000 hectares of mainly pine and eucalyptus in northern Uganda. The Norwegian forestry company Green Resources leases the land. It's state land from the Ugandan government, and they have certified the plantation under the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a UN mechanism. This means that they can sell carbon emission reductions from the plantations on the global market. The Swedish Energy Agency committed in 2011 to a 30-year contract to buy these emission reductions for Sweden. The plantation has been heavily criticized by various actors, and the Energy Agency terminated the contract in March 2020, last year, after 9 years. In this picture, you can see the plantation to the left and the village land to the right. When the different actors talk about new healthy forests, it sounds a bit like they are talking about regeneration of the natural vegetation. But the so-called degraded woodland savanna to the right is in fact probably much more close to the natural vegetation of the area than the plantation to the left. Even if the plantation has more trees per hectare, it has lower biodiversity than the savanna. Could not the establishment of this plantation be seen as degradation in this context? So this is Green Resources narrative about Kachung. It can be summarized like this. Kachung has over the past 20 years been increasingly degraded as local people have illegally taken down trees for fuel wood and cleared land for agriculture. This situation is continuous and cannot be stopped without external intervention. Our plantation will contribute to local sustainable development as it will reduce degradation by increasing the amount of trees. It will also create additional local benefits, including local jobs. So we decided to make our own satellite image analysis coupled with local investigations in order to look into this proposed degradation that Green Resources is claiming. Continuous and increasingly degraded because of loss of trees. This is from the article we published on this in 2016. This map showed tree cover in the reserve in 2000, which is the top map, and 2005, the bottom map. Can you see if I move my cursor on this? Yes, good. This purple lines are showing the borders of the plantation of Kachung Reserve. So it's inside here and also inside here. So this is what it looked like in 2000 and 2005. So the greener it is, the thicker the tree cover. Now, this shows what it looked like just before Green Resources submitted their documents to the UN, where they claimed that the reserve land was being degraded due to deforestation. As you can see, it doesn't really look like the tree cover is reducing. In fact, several areas look greener than in 2005 than in 2000. And this histogram, I know it might be a bit difficult to see, but it shows that the tree cover has been increased from being mainly about 12 to 18% in most of the pixels to being between 14 and 22%. So an increase in these 5 years. We also combined this mapping study with analysis of historical documents and interviews with local people about land use change. Green Resources had also interviewed residents and read historical documents, but we found that they treated local residents telling of their stories of land use change as less important. For example, local people explained to us that during the unrest in northern Uganda caused by the Lord's Resistance Army, a lot of refugees came to this area from late 1990s up to 2009 when they went back to their homes. The local people rented out their fields to the refugees and cleared new land to cope with these increased needs. The refugees also made charcoal from trees and sold in order to make some money during this time. By the time Green Resources were there, investigating the area, the refugees were leaving and trees had begun to regenerate. However, Green Resources did not take these fluctuating circumstances into consideration. They chose to interpret the landscape as degraded and as continuous degradation that could not be reversed. Since this suited their purpose of proposing a plantation, this really shows how difficult it is to prove what is called additionality, that trees planted would not have grown there anyway if it was not for a certain project. Also, the CDM process with all the documentation required by the United Nations did not pick this up. The company was allowed to prepare their own satellite image analysis, and we could not see that this fact had been properly checked or questioned by various independent verifications. Furthermore, a requirement of being a clean development mechanism project is that it should contribute equally to global greenhouse gas emission reduction and local sustainable development. Kachung is bordered by 19 villages where people mainly live on subsistence farming. Our studies showed how people used many different trees available locally for different purposes and had well-established ways of taking firewood in order to ensure regeneration. There was no basis for Green Resources' sweeping talk about how local people caused deforestation. The plantation affected these people negatively. Instead of many different trees, they now have a monoculture of unfamiliar trees nearby. We saw that what Green Resources called unused bushland was in fact used as grazing land and field by some of the most marginalized people. Trees were used for many purposes. Women and the poorest household were worst affected by the loss of access to land and trees. Jobs created by the plantation did not always go to people from villages nearby, and the jobs were often seasonal and poorly paid. Projects initiated by Green Resources that distributed tree seedlings to farmers prioritized richer households that had most available land. Projects such as distribution of improved cooking stoves were unsuccessful. Some smaller improvements, such as boreholes improvement and such things, were okay, but they were not enough to compensate for the lost land and forest resources, according to most of the local people that we interviewed. So does Kachung represent a single, unlucky, unique project? It's not possible to learn from this project and create better projects. Well, this project represents quite well what we commonly see in rural development in general. That projects are put forward like they are good for local communities, but often they represent other interests and seldom take into account local inequalities, differences. A community is not homogeneous. There is often a local elite who benefits and claims to be happy with the project, but there are also other marginalized groups who don't benefit and don't have a voice. This is difficult to address in any project. It is difficult to ensure social benefits in tree planting projects because every locality is a unique place with its own history, own situations, and local hierarchies. Projects need to find out what people need in that specific locality and how local structures work. This is difficult and time-consuming. Let's not forget that many of these tree planting projects are not charities. They are for-profit organizations. Most of the carbon credits today are really cheap, and projects often don't pay local people enough to compensate for them losing agricultural land. Also, the project usually don't start with the question, what can we do for this community? They don't talk to farmers and find out exactly which trees they would like to plant where. They start with the urgent need for removing carbon from the atmosphere, created by our continued emissions. Then they identify places where it's seemingly cheap and easy to plant trees, and in fact it's much simpler to make a monoculture plantation than start long processes discussing with farmers. This is why many projects fail to produce local benefits and may even cause negative effects. There are some projects that seem to make a real effort in involving people from the beginning in planning processes and make sure people have land title deeds and so on. Some work with standards and certifications such as Plan Vivo. These are important steps towards better processes, but just because there are standards of how we want to work that are pursued and followed up doesn't mean that we can totally relax about this. Standards can still miss important aspects of this issue. They all depend on individuals who do the follow-up and verification. People who work with conducting verification also are people with jobs to protect, and they may not want to seem difficult or demanding. Also, even if standards work together with local organizations, it may not guarantee that processes are good enough. Local organizations can also have problematic persons in charge, people with elitist views who don't care about the marginalized groups, and so on. So simply referring to standards, local participation, and so on is not a safeguard to ensure that everything is in order. It's not really enough, in my view. Some actors come into carbon forestry from a background of working with communities in agroforestry. This includes Vi Skogen in Sweden. I believe these actors are possibly best positioned to create good projects, mainly because they start with the question of what the local needs are. But then they have to get into this tricky and expensive business of certifying and counting the carbon captured as a byproduct of their community projects. It costs them money that could have been spent on the project and may seem unnecessary. I would wish that we want to sponsor good community-based projects without needing to know exactly how much carbon is stored in each project. It seems to me that we need to know this just in case to try to offset our emissions that we're generating in order to somehow feel we're compensating for our emissions, rather than focusing on cutting our emissions and sponsoring good projects anyway. I want to point out that I still have not visited a Plan Vivo certified project or a Vi Skogen project. In a new project, me and 2 colleagues hope to eventually visit several localities in East Africa where carbon forestry projects are taking place and investigate how standards and certifications affect the results. So thank you for listening. I'd like to acknowledge both the funding of the Swedish Research Council and Formas, the project participant Clara Fischer, who was part of the previous project I've been talking about in Kachung, and both Clara and Linda are part of new projects that are looking into carbon forestry. And we have had research assistants and master students, and some of these master students have spent longer time in Kachung and written very interesting theses about, for example, about the stove project and why it didn't work, how women were affected differently by the plantation, and how marginalized groups were affected. So this is a list of the publications that from the project I've described, and our report is said here in the bottom is linked from my CV page at SLU. I couldn't really put a link here in the presentation, but in this report, it's all these master's theses are also listed, so you can find them. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions.